Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with a news item on page number 1 of the Delhi edition of The Hindu relevant for GS paper 2. There is a law called Kerala Police Act of 2011. This law has been amended. How? An ordinance has been promulgated by the governor of Kerala. And because of this ordinance, what has happened? A new section 118 capital A has been added to this law. This has been criticized by many opposition political parties, human rights activists, free speech activists. They accuse that this section 118 clause A goes against the freedom of speech and expression, which is a fundamental right under Article 19 clause 1 clause A of the Constitution. The activists also allege that this will have a crippling effect on the free speech in our society. But what is this section 118 capital A? If you use a computer device, let's say a laptop, a desktop, a smartphone, and you transmit messages, and these messages are threatening, abusive, humiliating, or defamatory. Let's say, for example, I put out a tweet or a Facebook post. I know that this tweet or Facebook post is false. But despite that, I'm putting this across because I want to cause injury to the mind, to the reputation of another person. This is a crime. I will be arrested under section 118 capital A. I can be sentenced to 3 years in jail, or a fine of 10,000 rupees can be imposed on me, or it can be both as well. Both a jail term for 3 years as well as a fine of 10,000 rupees. But if this ordinance is challenged in the court of law, it will be struck down. Why? Because we have a precedent, a judicial precedent. What sort of judicial precedent? The year was 2015. A 2-judge bench of the Supreme Court. One judge was Justice Chalameshwar. The other was Justice Rohinton Fali Nariman. What they did, they struck down Section 66A of Information Technology Act of the year 2000. This act was passed in the year 2000. In the year 2008, without any debate or discussion in the Parliament, Section 66 capital A was inserted into this act of 2000. And this section 66A was struck down by a 2-judge bench of the Supreme Court in the year 2015, which is famously known as Shreya Singhal case or Shreya Singhal versus Union of India 2015. The text of section 118 capital A is more or less similar, identical to section 66 capital A of IT Act. This section 66A said, punishment for those who send offensive messages through communication system. Any person who sends a message and this message is grossly offensive, has menacing character, is causing annoyance, inconvenience, danger, obstruction, insult, injury, criminal intimidation, enmity, hatred, ill will, this person shall be sentenced to a term of 3 years in jail, or a fine is also to be paid by someone who is convicted under section 66 capital A of IT Act. This act was challenged in the Supreme Court by a law student, Shreya Singhal, and a landmark judgment, a 52-page judgment, was delivered by 2-judge bench of the Supreme Court in 2015. Supreme Court struck down section 66 capital A of IT Act, saying it violates the fundamental guarantees of freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution. Supreme Court said, among many other things, Supreme Court said all these terms are ill-defined, or at best they are not defined at all. So what is the definition of inconvenience, annoyance, danger, obstruction, intimidation? What do we mean when we say a post, if it is grossly offensive or has menacing character? All these are very vague ideas mentioned in this act. That is what will make this section liable to abuse or misuse and that is why this section 66A is unconstitutional. So if section 66A is unconstitutional and section 118 capital A is basically a replica of section 66A of the IT Act, this section will also be declared unconstitutional by the judiciary. In 2015, the then Additional Solicitor General of India, Mr. Tushar Mehta now is the Solicitor General of India. Tushar Mehta pleaded before the two judges of the Supreme Court that please don't strike down section 66 capital A. Why? Dear judges, if you are saying that a law can be misused or abused, that is not a ground for striking down that law. That means just because a law is liable to be misused, that doesn't mean Supreme Court can strike down that law. Supreme Court can strike down a law if the law is against the fundamental guarantees mentioned in the Constitution. But Supreme Court did not agree with the argument of Tushar Mehta and ultimately struck down section 66A of the Information Technology Act. So if tomorrow there is a statement in your prelims examination, abuse of law is a ground for striking down a law, this statement is correct. We can only hope that the Kerala government decides not to enforce this law and allow this ordinance to lapse. Why? Because ordinance is basically having a temporary character. Tomorrow when Kerala Legislative Assembly will be convened again, then within 6 weeks, this ordinance is to be replaced by a law. And if within 6 weeks, a bill is not introduced in the Legislative Assembly of Kerala to replace this ordinance, then this ordinance will lapse 6 weeks after the reconvening of Kerala Legislative Assembly. So we can only hope that the government decides in Kerala not to enforce this law and allow this ordinance to lapse. That is what you need to understand from this newspaper article. Now let's look at another newspaper article on page number 9, primarily relevant for your prelims examination as well as GS paper 3. 132 countries, they have attended global meet on criminal finances. Here we need to talk about few things. Number one, this was the 4th Global Conference on Criminal Finances and Cryptocurrency. This conference is organized jointly by 3 organizations. One is Interpol, the other is Europol, and the third one is Basel Institute on Governance. Now let's look at what is this Basel Institute on Governance can be relevant for your prelims examination. It is basically a not-for-profit organization, or should we say not-for-profit Swiss foundation. It's based in Switzerland and it was established in the year 2003. Very important for your prelims examination. This not-for-profit Swiss foundation, Basel Institute on Governance, it is basically an institute which is associated with the University of Basel. This organization primarily deals with both private players as well as governments, public organizations. To do what? They prevent and combat corruption. What this organization also does, and this is a very important statement for your prelims, it helps countries recover stolen assets from abroad. So from this newspaper article, number one, what we need to understand, few details regarding Basel Institute on Governance. It is not-for-profit Swiss foundation established in the year 2003. It is basically an institute associated with University of Basel. It helps countries recover stolen assets from abroad, and it primarily deals and cooperates with both private entities as well as public organizations, and they help in preventing and combating corruption. Second, what is this Interpol? Interpol basically is International Criminal Police Organization. It is basically an intergovernmental organization. How many countries are part of Interpol? 194 countries. And what Interpol does, it helps the police in all these 194 countries, so that the police in all these 194 countries, they work together to ensure that the world is a safer place to live. This agency, Interpol, has its headquarters in Lyon, which is in France. Interpol was established in the year 1923. Another important statement for your prelims examination: India is a member of Interpol since the year 1956. Another important detail: any country which is part of Interpol, what this country has to do, it has to maintain National Central Bureau. And basically this National Central Bureau is point of contact for Interpol. Interpol helps these 194 countries in tackling three major crimes. One is counter-terrorism, the other is organized and emerging crime, and the third one is cyber crime. Organized crime, for example, drug trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, gambling, extortion. One very important statement regarding Interpol is that what this Interpol does, it connects police across the world, even if these individual member nations do not have diplomatic relations with each other. For example, here is one country, India. There is another country, X. India and X, they do not share diplomatic relations with each other. But here is an Indian citizen who travels to X. But this individual is wanted in India for drug trafficking, for human trafficking, for terrorist activities. Even though India and this country, they do not share diplomatic relations with each other, even then Interpol will connect these two countries. And Interpol, what it does, it basically facilitates information exchange, knowledge exchange, research between nations. And all of this is done by issuing color-coded notices. And it's important to understand for your prelims examination that these color-coded notices are issued in 4 languages. One is English, the other is Spanish, then there is French, and then there is Arabic. One color-coded notice is red notice. What is a red notice? It is basically a request to locate an individual, arrest this individual, so that this individual can be extradited. So a red notice is basically a request to locate and arrest an individual pending extradition. Then there is yellow notice. Yellow notice is issued to locate missing persons. Often these missing persons are minors. And this is very important, very useful in cases of human trafficking or in cases of missing persons who are missing because of various natural calamities. Then there is blue notice. Blue notice is primarily issued to collect information about a person's identity, his location, or his activities. Then there is black notice. Black notice is a request to seek information on unidentified bodies. In match the following type questions, this can be very important for your examination. There is another notice called green notice. Green notice is issued to provide warnings or intelligence about persons who are likely to commit terrorist activities or criminal activities. For example, there is an individual X. He has already committed a crime in India. Now he has traveled to Germany. Interpol may issue green notice warning Germany that this individual has already committed some crimes in other countries and this person is likely to commit crimes in Germany as well. So from this newspaper article, 3 things we need to understand. Number 1, Basel Institute on Governance. Number 2, Interpol. And the third one is Europol. Europol is basically European Union's law enforcement agency. And the main objective, main goal of Europol is to achieve safe Europe. And the headquarter of Europol is in Hague, the Netherlands. Now let's look at another newspaper article on page number 10, relevant for your prelims. India, Thailand, Singapore naval exercise concludes. This was the second edition of this exercise. And what is the name of this exercise? SITMEX. SITMEX first was conducted in 2019. Now it has been conducted again in 2020. But SITMEX is a trilateral between India, Thailand and Singapore. It's a naval exercise and it has been conducted only twice in the past, 19 and now in 2020. Don't confuse it with SIMBEX. What is SIMBEX? SIMBEX is basically a maritime exercise but between Singapore and India. This SIMBEX is held annually, very important statement for your prelims examination, and it is being conducted since the year 1994. That is why the 27th edition of SIMBEX will be held from November 23 to 25. So India, Thailand, Singapore trilateral naval exercise is called SITMEX. India and Singapore have a bilateral maritime exercise called SIMBEX. Between India and Thailand, there is another exercise, that's what we call Maitri. But please don't confuse yourself. Maitri is basically a military exercise. It is between the armies of India and Thailand. It is not a naval exercise. Now let's look at some of the editorials and columns from today's newspaper. Almost all the columns we have either discussed in the past or are irrelevant for your examination. For example, there is a column on the rise of Asaduddin Owaisi in the elections, irrelevant for your exam. Then there is an editorial on the local elections that are being conducted in Jammu and Kashmir, again not relevant for your exam. Then there is an editorial on the arrest of Hafiz Muhammad Saeed in Pakistan, sentencing of Hafiz Saeed, which we have covered in the past. Then there is this column on RCEP, but we have covered this topic on 5th of November 2019, again on 16th of November 2020. So if you haven't followed these two videos, please go through these two videos. Everything related to this newspaper column would become crystal clear to you. If you have understood what RCEP is, what are the drawbacks of RCEP? Should India have joined RCEP or not? What are the advantages of staying away from RCEP? All this, if you know, then please don't read further future columns on this topic. Now let's look at practice questions, first for prelims and then for mains. Practice question number 1. Rajashekhar, a Sanskrit poet and dramatist, was patronized by Mahipala of Gurjara Prathiharas. Question number 2. Who among the following Tughlaq rulers established a separate department for agriculture named Diwan-e-Kohi? His name is Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Question number 3. An ordinance can be promulgated by the state governor when the state legislative assembly is adjourned for 6 weeks. No. In such case, ordinance cannot be promulgated. Ordinance can be promulgated only when the state legislative assembly is not in session. Or should we say the state legislative assembly is prorogued. When the assembly is adjourned, ordinance cannot be promulgated. The ordinance promulgated cannot be challenged in any court of law. No, it can be challenged. That's how the ordinance which was promulgated by Andhra Pradesh governor, which reduced the term of state election commissioner in Andhra Pradesh, this ordinance was struck down by the court. So judicial review is part of the basic structure of Indian constitution. Even ordinances can be challenged in the court of law. So both these statements are incorrect. Which of the following are correctly paired? Indra, it's a naval exercise between India and Russia, correct. Ipsamar, it's between India, Brazil and South Africa, correct. Because India, Brazil, South Africa, maritime. SIMBEX deals with India and Singapore. All these statements are correct. When you look at Ipsamar, it basically means India, Brazil, South Africa, maritime. There is also something called IBSA Dialogue Forum. And this IBSA Dialogue Forum is for promoting international cooperation among these three countries, India, Brazil and South Africa. If you look at India, Brazil, South Africa, they are southern nations in the south. That is why we call IBSA as South-South cooperation. And this IBSA was formalized in the year 2003, and it was formalized in the year 2003 by adopting something called Brasilia Declaration. Very important for your prelims examination. And it was in this Brasilia Declaration that all the three countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, they agreed that there is urgently a requirement for the reform in United Nations Security Council. And SIMBEX between India and Singapore is held annually since the year 1994. Prelims 2020 question with reference to the history of India. Ulgulan or the Great Tumult is the description of which of the following events? Birsa Munda's revolt of 1899-1900. Now let's look at the mains based questions. Number one, in spite of its current efforts, India is still slated to fall short of the Paris Agreement's long-term goal of limiting global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Discuss the challenges faced by India in this regard. Why? Because Prime Minister Modi, he was addressing a G20 event and he called for an integrated fight against climate change. Basically, Prime Minister Modi is saying that we are exceeding the Paris Accord targets, but despite that, we may fall short of the long-term goal, which is to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Question number two, what is free speech? Does it include a right to offend others as well? That is it from our newspaper analysis for today. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day.